buildings towering out of green interspaces, surrounded by the smaller circles of spaceports and industrial suburbs. The difference was that any of these were as large as Camelot on Excalibur, or 4 Wardshavens on Graham, and Malverton itself was almost half the size of the whole barony of Trascan. "They aren't any more civilized than we are, Patrick. There are just more of them. If there were 2 billion people on Graham, which I hope there never will be, Graham would have cities like this too. One thing, the government of a planet like Marduk would have to have something more elaborate than the loose feudalism of the Sword Worlds. Maybe this Goldbergocracy of theirs had been forced upon them by the sheer complexity of the population and its problems." Alvin Carford took a quick look around him to make sure none of the Marducans were in earshot. "I don't care how many people they have," he said. "Marduk can be had. A wolf never cares how many sheep there are in the flock. With 20 ships, we could take this planet like we took Eglindsby. There'd be losses coming in, sure, but after we were in and down, we'd have it." "Where would we get 20 ships?" Tanith, at a pinch, could muster 5 or 6, counting the free space Vikings who used the base facilities. They would have to leave a couple to hold the planet. Beowulf had 1, and another almost completed, and now there was an Amaterasu ship. But to assemble a space Viking armada of 20, he shook his head. The real reason why space Vikings had never raided a civilized planet successfully had always been their inability to combine under one command in sufficient strength. Besides, he didn't want to raid Marduk. A raid, if successful, would yield immense treasures, but cause 100, even 1,000 times as much destruction, and he didn't want to destroy anything civilized. The landing stages of the palace were crowded when he and Prince Bentrick landed, and, at a discreet distance, swarms of air vehicles circled, creating a control problem for the police. Parting from Bentrick, he was escorted to the suite prepared for him. It was luxurious in the extreme, but scarcely above Sword World standards. There were a surprising number of human servants, groveling and fawning and getting underfoot, and doing work robots could have been doing better. What robots there were inefficient, and much work and ingenuity had been lavished on efforts to copy human form to the detriment of function. After getting rid of most of the superfluous servants, he put on a screen and began sampling the newscasts. There were telescopic views of the Nemesis from some craft on orbit nearby, and he watched the officers and men of the Victrix being disembarked. There were other views of their landing at some naval installation on the ground, and he could see reporters being chevied away by naval ground police. And there was a wide range of commentary opinion. The government had already denied that 1. Prince Bentrick had captured the Nemesis and brought her in as a prize, and 2. The Space Vikings had captured Prince Bentrick and were holding him for ransom. Beyond that, the government was trying to sit on the whole story, and the opposition was hinting darkly at corrupt deals and sinister plots. Prince Bentrick arrived in the midst of an impassioned tirade against pusillanimous traitors surrounding His Majesty, who were betraying Marduk to the Space Vikings. "Why doesn't your government publish the facts and put a stop to that nonsense?" Trask asked. "Oh, let them rave," Bentrick replied. "The longer the government waits, the more they'll be ridiculed when the facts are published. Or the more people will be convinced that the government had something to hush up, and had to take time to construct a plausible story." He kept the thought to himself. It was their government; how they mismanaged it was their own business. He found there was no bartending robot. He had to have a human servant bring drinks. He made up his mind to have a few of the Nemesis robots sent down to him. The formal presentation would be in the evening. There would be a dinner first, and because Trask had not yet been formally presented, he couldn't dine with the king, but because he was, or claimed to be, Viceroy of Tanith, he ranked as a chief of state and would dine with the Crown Prince, to whom there would be an informal introduction first. This took place in a small antechamber off the banquet hall. The Crown Prince and Crown Princess and Princess Bentrick were there when they arrived. The Crown Prince was a man of middle age, graying at the temples, with a glassy stare that betrayed contact lenses. The resemblance between him and his father was apparent. Both had the same studious and impractical expression that might have been professors on the same university faculty. He shook hands with Trask, assuring him of the gratitude of the court and royal family. "You know, Simon is next in succession, after myself and my little daughter," he said. "That's too close to take chances with him." He turned to Bentrick. "I'm afraid this is your last space adventure, Simon. You'll have to be a spaceport spaceman from now on."
"I shan't be sorry," Princess Bentrick said. "And if anybody owes Prince Trask gratitude, I do." She pressed his hands warmly. "Prince Trask, my son wants to meet you very badly. He's 10 years old, and he thinks space Vikings are romantic heroes."
"He should be one for a while." He should just see a planet space Vikings had raided. Most of the people at the upper end of the table were diplomats, ambassadors from Odin and Baldur and Isis and Ishtar and Aton and the other civilized worlds. No doubt they hadn't actually expected horns and a spiked tail, or even tattooing in a nose ring, but after all, space Vikings were just some sort of neo-barbarians, weren't they? On the other hand, they had all seen views and gotten descriptions of the Nemesis, and had heard about the ship action on Audholma. And this Prince Trask, a space Viking prince, that sounded civilized enough, had saved a life with only 3 other lives, one almost at an end, between it and the throne. And they had heard about the screen conversation with King McKill. So they were courteous through the meal and tried to get as close as possible to him in the procession to the throne room. King McKill wore a golden crown topped by the planetary emblem, which must have weighed twice as much as a combat helmet, and 4-edged robes that would weigh more than a suit of space armor. They weren't nearly as ornate, though, as the regalia of King Angus I of Graham. He rose to clasp Prince Bentrick's hand, calling him dear cousin, and congratulating him on his gallant fight and fortunate escape. That knocks any court-martial talk on the head, Trask thought. He remained standing to shake hands with Trask, calling him valued friend to me and my house. First person singular. That must be causing some lifted eyebrows. Then the king sat down, and the rest of the roomful filed up onto the dais to be received. And finally it was over, and the king rose and proceeded, followed by his immediate suite between the bowing and curtsying court and out the wide doors. After a decent interval, Crown Prince Edvard escorted him and Prince Bentrick down the same route, the others falling in behind, and across the hall to the ballroom, where there was soft music and refreshments. It wasn't too unlike a court reception on Excalibur, except that the drinks and canapes were being dispensed by human servants. He was wondering what sort of court functions Angus I of Graham was holding by now. After half an hour, a posse of court functionaries approached and informed him that it had pleased His Majesty to command Prince Trask to attend him in his private chambers. There was an audible gasp at this. Both Prince Bentrick and the Crown Prince were trying not to grin too broadly. Evidently, this didn't happen too often. He followed the functionaries from the ballroom, and the eyes of everybody else followed him. Old King McKill received him alone, in a small, comfortably shabby room behind vast ones of incredible splendor. He wore fur-lined slippers and a loose robe with a fur collar, and his little black cap of maintenance. He was standing when Trask entered. When the guards closed the door and left them alone, He beckoned Trask to a couple of chairs with a low table, on which were decanters